The autumn wind whistled through the broken branches, carrying the faint smell of old smoke from the abandoned fireplace. Ethan Miller, a 42-year-old veteran, paused in front of the sagging wooden house, his hand gripping the strap of a tattered backpack until the zipper squeaked. Through the rotting fence, 8-year-old Noah stood by a fallen bicycle, clutching a one-eyed cloth doll, his gaze a mix of fear and defiance. A crumpled photo slipped from Ethan's pocket, the boy in it laughing bright beside a mother who now existed only in memory. Step through the gate, or turn away? Ethan felt his heart beat, as if the house itself was waiting for his answer. The yellow light from a single bulb hanging off the old wooden ceiling spilled over the small dining table, just enough space for two. Ethan Miller pulled out a chair and lowered himself into it like it was some ritual he couldn't break. His eyes slid, almost by habit, to the other side. The chair that stayed empty, cold as an old scar that never healed. The silence in the room was heavy. You could hear the pendulum clock out in the hallway, its steady beat cutting through the quiet like a reminder he couldn't escape. He set a white plate down in front of him, added the fork, the knife, the glass that had long since lost its shine. Habit made him prepare for two, even when there was only one. His rough hands, worn from years of holding a rifle, sometimes froze when they brushed against the edge of the opposite chair, as if the faintest touch might stir up the ghost of someone who wasn't there anymore. In his coat pocket lay a small wooden cross, pressed close to his chest. He carried it the way you carry memories you can't put down. The wood had been smoothed by his fingertips over the years. Every time he pulled it out, it brought back the smell of gunpowder, the sharp echo of voices lost on the battlefield. Outside the window, the wind rushed through the black pines, high and shrill. For a second, Ethan flinched. It sounded too much like bullets tearing through the air. He set his spoon down, his hand trembling, eyes locked on the dark glass. Memories stormed back without warning, rain-soaked nights, mud-swallowing boots, a body falling into silence, a voice cut short. The past never really left him, it just waited, close enough to tap him on the shoulder at any moment. He drew a hard breath, forcing himself to turn back toward the table. That empty chair sat like a witness, unblinking, keeping watch over the fear he tried to bury. Slowly, he reached into his pocket, wrapping his fingers tight around the cross. His thumb found the small crack in the wood, and something inside him clenched. The past wasn't gone, and it wasn't hidden. It was right there, sitting across from him every night, just like that chair. The spoon slipped against the plate, the sound sharp and cold before fading back into silence. Ethan lifted his head, eyes fixed on that space across the table. No more looking away. His heart still hammered, his breathing still uneven, but his eyes held steady now. He knew fear wasn't going to vanish. But in that moment, with his pulse racing and his fingers pressed to the cross, he felt something else, too, a thin thread of strength pulling tight inside him. Outside, the wind kept moving through the trees, but the sound had softened somehow. Ethan stayed seated, hand gripping the cross in his pocket, eyes on the empty chair. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring. But he knew this: some fears can only be faced by sitting with them, night after night, meal after meal, breath after breath. Night came on slow, like the kind of town that never knew how to hurry. The yellow light still hung over the worn-out table. Ethan sat there a long while, his hand tight around the small wooden cross in his pocket, just to remind himself he was still here. The empty chair across from him gave no reply, but he was used to that silence. He never thought he needed much. After the years he spent in combat, where death was always one breath away, big dreams felt like some luxury made for other men. All Ethan ever wanted was something simple: a dinner with the sound of silverware on a plate, a young voice asking for another slice of bread, the scuffle of little feet across a wooden floor. Just that. But that kind of simple was out of reach, like a dream too far to touch. In the corner, beside a low wooden cabinet, a pair of children's shoes sat still. A thin layer of dust covered the toes, like a shroud laid over hope that never came true. He'd bought them one winter's day at a thrift shop on Main Street, the cold wind cutting at his face. They weren't meant for any child in particular. Just for the faint hope that someday there might be a reason to use them. He brought them home, set them in place, and waited for something he couldn't even bring himself to name. Sometimes, in half-sleep, he thought he heard it, the quick patter of small steps across the floorboards, a laugh that flickered and vanished. But when his eyes opened, there was only the thick dark and the sound of his own breathing. He feared those dreams, because they reminded him of what he didn't have. And yet, they also kept him tied to this life, in that lonely wooden house, in a town where hardly anyone even remembered his name. There were nights he thought about leaving, finding a bigger city, a place with enough noise and people to drown out the emptiness. But every time he stepped onto the porch and looked at the dark pines stretching down the ridge, he stayed. This place held memories he couldn't pack up, and it held fragile hopes he couldn't let go. That small dream, thin as smoke, was what bound him here. Ethan crouched down and brushed the dust from those little shoes. His hand trembled, but the gesture was firm, as if he refused to let them disappear into nothing. He set the shoes on the table, right next to the empty plate. A broken image, maybe, but enough to make the room feel less hollow. Outside, the wind had softened, only the murmur of pine needles brushing against each other. Ethan leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes. He knew the fear was still there, the old ghost still near. But he also knew that the small dream, the simplest of them all, was the thing keeping him upright. And those shoes, gathering dust though they were, stayed as a reminder that someday, silence could be broken by the sound of life. It was a late autumn Sunday morning, and the fog still clung to the roof of the wooden house when Ethan opened the door. The chill cut through his coat, sharp enough to remind him winter wasn't far off. He tugged the edge of his old knit cap down and leaned on his wooden cane, stepping carefully off the porch. Every step felt heavy, but by now it was part of the rhythm he forced himself to keep. The road to the red brick church stretched out ahead, covered with fallen maple leaves that cracked under his boots. His uneven footsteps left a broken trail, steady but stubborn, as if he had to prove to himself he could still go the distance. Black pines rose on both sides, tall and still, like silent sentries. Ethan lowered his head and walked, the sound of his cane tapping against the pavement blending with the crunch of dry leaves. When he reached the small square by the church, the bells began to ring. The sound rolled through the quiet, deep and steady, falling over the town like another layer of fog, thick, unhurried. Townsfolk were already gathering, coats buttoned tight, faded dresses, wool scarves someone had knitted at home. They walked in little clusters, talking softly. Most didn't meet his eyes, but they gave him a thin smile and a nod as they passed. Along the curb, old pickup trucks sat idle, paint worn to dull gray, doors rusted through. Their tires had left tracks in the gravel that looked like lines on a page, marking years gone by. Ethan took it all in. It felt like a backdrop he'd seen 100 times before, unchanged, season after season. He walked through it, surrounded by scraps of conversation, struck by the dull sameness of the town. On the surface, nothing here ever seemed to change. But in Ethan's head, old images bled into every breath. The ringing of the church bell pulled up memories of the barracks, when alarms sent men scrambling out half awake, boots half laced. His chest tightened. He stumbled for a second, gripping the cane harder to keep from losing his balance. He paused at the church steps, breathing in the damp smell of red brick mixed with pine. Children darted past him, clutching peppermints their grandmother had handed out. Their laughter carried bright through the morning before fading into the air. Ethan watched them, feeling that same mix of distance and longing. In those quick little steps, he saw the simple dream he'd never been able to claim for himself. Inside, the organ started, low and steady, calling people into the pews. Ethan lifted his foot, slow and deliberate, and stepped forward, leaving the path of yellowed leaves behind. For most, it was just another Sunday morning. For him, it was another reckoning, facing the memories, the silence, and the quiet ache he never found words for. Ethan had just stepped onto the church steps when something ahead made him stop cold. At the big iron gate, where the red paint was peeling in flakes, a man in a worn coat shoved a boy out. The door swung half shut, the hinge screeching like a blade cutting into the quiet morning. The kid was maybe 6, maybe 7. His small hands gripped the bars, forehead pressed against the cold iron. In his fist he clutched a plastic toy car, one wheel broken, the colors faded with time. His eyes were wide open, no crying, no sound. Just that tight, swallowed silence, the kind you learn too young when tears aren't allowed. Ethan froze, his grip tightening on the wooden cane. His heartbeat slowed, but each thud landed heavy in his chest. Around him, the church bell tolling, folks filing in, the organ humming, all of it seemed to fall away, leaving only the boy at the gate. That silence pulled him back to other children's faces, lost in rubble, in places where war never let a cry last more than a second. His calf twitched, his breath came short, as if his body wanted to move while his mind still held back. The boy stood there, sweater thin and dusty, cheeks raw from the cold. He didn't look at anyone, his eyes locked on the crack of the door, where others had already turned their backs on him. The autumn wind pushed through, rattling the dry maple leaves caught on the bars. One leaf broke loose, brushed the boy's shoulder, then dropped beside his toy car. Such a small thing, but it cut into Ethan like a knife. The cruelty wasn't in the shove, it was in the indifference, the silence louder than any shout. For a moment, Ethan was back in the trenches, night stretched out, hearing a child's voice carry from a far-off village before it vanished under gunfire. The old fear surged that the past still clung to him, that even in the ordinary, a door could swing open straight into darkness. But this time, he didn't turn away. He lifted his cane and walked toward the gate. Each tap against the bricks echoed heavy, drew a glance or two before people quickly looked elsewhere. Nobody stopped. It was just him and the boy, caught in a silence thick as stone while the crowd streamed inside. His heart still pounded, but the beat was steady now. The weight in his chest shifted into a quiet resolve. That boy, silent, small, pushed out, was the mirror of everything Ethan had witnessed, everything he'd feared. And he understood, some fears only break when you face them, step closer, and refuse to look away. He stood before the iron gate, his shadow falling across the bricks, blending into the boy's smaller one as he clutched the battered toy car. In the silence, something stirred, not from the crowd, but from deep inside Ethan's own chest. The woman who had shoved the boy outside turned her back and slipped quickly into the church. The hem of her heavy coat brushed through the doorway, disappearing with the screech of the iron hinge. No glance back, no pause in her step. The gate closed behind her, leaving a cold emptiness between the bars. The boy stood still, his small hands wrapped tight around the iron, holding on to a world that had just refused him. His brown hair was tangled and dusty, his forehead damp with sweat, but he didn't cry. Noah, that's the name Ethan caught when someone in the crowd had called out, looked no more than 8. His thin shoulders trembled against the late autumn air, the old sweater he wore too thin to keep him warm. His lips pressed into a hard line, like if he opened his mouth, everything he'd swallowed would spill out in a cry he wouldn't allow himself to make. Ethan stopped, his breath breaking into a white cloud. The picture hit him hard, pulling him back to the field hospital 15 years earlier. He remembered lying there on a cold iron cot, bandages soaked through, blood seeping slow. People passed by, busy with others, while he lay in silence, unseen, unasked about. That feeling of being left behind, treated like a shadow, had nearly broken him then. And now, in Noah's quiet stare, he saw himself again. The boy gripped his toy car tighter. The plastic body was cracked, one wheel loose, clattering when the wind touched it. Cheap as it was, he held it like treasure, the same way Ethan had once clung to the wooden cross from his fallen buddy. For the abandoned, small things like that became the only rope tying them to the world. Time seemed to slow at the church gate. The crowd had thinned, the bells had faded. Only Ethan and the boy remained, divided by the iron bars, sharing a silence heavy enough to choke the chest. Ethan felt his own heartbeat sinking with the boy's slight tremble. No tears, no begging, just the weight of silence pressing down until he could hardly breathe. He pushed the cane hard into the bricks, grounding himself against the rush of memory. He didn't know what to do just yet. But in the boy's eyes he read something familiar, someone waiting for another human being to stop, if only to prove he wasn't invisible. Ethan stayed there. He didn't move closer, didn't walk away. He let the silence stretch until it became a kind of rope between them. In that rope, the old fear stopped belonging to him alone, it was something he now shared with Noah. And in the raw chill of that late autumn morning, inside that wordless pause, a seed of quiet resolve took root, making it impossible for him to turn his back again. Ethan lifted his cane, ready to take a step, but his foot stalled. The space between the church steps and the iron gate couldn't have been more than a few short strides, yet inside him it stretched into a lifetime. It was a distance loaded with memories and fears he'd buried for years. Noah never looked up. The boy kept his head down, eyes locked on the toy car in his hand. His tiny knuckles were white from gripping so hard. The plastic creaked faintly, as if he feared that letting go would mean the whole world around him would shatter. No sound came from him, only a thin, uneven breath that shook with each draft slipping through the gate. Ethan stared at those small hands and found himself back in his own past, fingers gripping a rifle so tight they bled, not out of pride, but out of raw fear of losing his life, of losing the men beside him. The boy's trembling fingers looked like an echo of his own, clutching the edge of a blanket in a field hospital, fighting not to slide away from life. He drew in a deep breath. The cold air burned in his lungs, stabbing at his chest. The sounds around the church faded, the organ, the shuffling of shoes, even the bell itself. What remained were those pale fingers wrapped around a broken toy, the last fragile rope keeping a child on his feet in front of a gate that had shut him out. Ethan wanted to reach out, but his arm felt as heavy as his leg. He was afraid to break the silence that wasn't neglect, but the only wall the boy had built to protect himself. Pull one brick loose, and it might all collapse into tears. And Ethan knew some cracks, once touched, never heal. Time stretched, each heartbeat weighing him down. His cane shook in his calloused hand, but he didn't move. He kept his eyes fixed on those bloodless knuckles. The tightness in his chest swelled. Heavier than any gunfire or explosion he'd ever endured. On the battlefield, he could shoot back. Here, against this silence, he was left with nothing but himself, bare and defenseless. Another gust of wind scattered a few more maple leaves across Noah's tangled hair. The boy flinched, shoulders twitching, but his grip never loosened. Ethan saw it clear: strength doesn't always mean shouting, it can be holding tight to the one small thing you've got left, even when the world turns away. The gap between them still held, but in that moment, Ethan understood. The boy didn't need a hero to break down the gate. He needed a witness, someone willing to stand there and share the silence. And for the first time in years, Ethan allowed his own hands to tremble in rhythm with a child's. The heavy wooden door of the church swung open with a creak that sounded almost like a sigh. Out stepped a familiar figure, Mrs. Parker, her short gray hair tucked under a knit scarf, carrying a worn wicker basket lined with checkered cloth. Inside were a few bundles of fresh-baked cookies. The smell of butter and cinnamon drifted into the cold air, so out of place against the heavy scene at the iron gate. She stopped when her eyes landed on Ethan and the boy. For a beat, no one spoke. Then she shook her head slightly, her lips moving with the kind of weary habit you pick up after a lifetime of watching this town carry on. Other people's business, best not to step into it. The words slipped out soft, carried off by the wind, but clear enough. It wasn't cruelty. It was the quiet rule people told themselves to keep from getting pulled under. Ethan felt his chest tighten. He knew that attitude well. Most folks, when faced with something that isn't theirs, choose to turn away. Not out of malice, but out of fear of being dragged into troubles too heavy to carry. And he knew he'd done the same more than once. Looked away, let someone else's pain pass by, so long as it didn't reach him. Noah didn't move. His small fingers still clung to the bars, knuckles white, eyes fixed on the broken toy car. The silence thickened, settling over them like dust. Ethan could hear the awkward rhythm of his cane tapping against the bricks, a sound that felt more like proof of presence than anything else. He looked at Mrs. Parker, and what he saw wasn't coldness, it was exhaustion. The exhaustion of someone who had seen too much, and stopped believing that one small gesture could change anything. His mind pulled back to the war, to the times he marched past shattered villages. Sometimes all he did was glance, then keep walking, because orders forced his feet forward. Faces of children fading into smoke, and he left them behind, letting despair fold itself into the ashes. Now Mrs. Parker stood as a mirror of that truth: silence and distance were always easier than stepping in. A gust of wind rattled her basket, the clinking of glass jars inside sharp against the quiet. The sound startled Ethan, as if to remind him that fragile things shatter when no one holds them steady. He looked at Noah, then back at Mrs. Parker, and saw the choice laid bare: keep walking, or take one more step to break the silence. Mrs. Parker tugged at her scarf, let out another sigh, and walked on toward the parking lot, her small frame blending into the crowd. The smell of cookies still lingered near the gate, but her figure was gone. Ethan stayed where he was, alone with the boy and the weight of his own silence. And he understood, if he turned away now, he'd be nothing more than another shadow, one of the many who chose to leave things undone. Mrs. Parker's figure had just slipped out of sight behind the line of old pickups, but her last look stayed etched in Ethan's mind. It was like a cold mirror, showing him the very thing he hated most: indifference, that turning away people do just to keep their own peace. There was no malice in it, no sharpness, just weariness, the reflex of a life lived by the rule, "That's not my business." But that calm shrug stung Ethan more than any blunt refusal ever could. He turned back to Noah. The boy was still there, still as a forgotten shadow. His small hands clutched the plastic toy car, chin tucked down, hair falling over half his face. His shadow stretched long on the damp concrete, blurred by leftover fog. It was a lonely shadow, fragile, but stubborn enough that Ethan couldn't look away. The memories came hard and fast. He saw himself again on the convoys rolling past villages left in flames. Kids stood at the roadside, eyes wide, hands reaching out without a word. He'd sat on the truck bed, rifle held tight, eyes fixed straight ahead. Not because he didn't see them, but because he wasn't allowed to stop. Orders mattered more. The survival of the unit mattered more. And so he left them standing there, as if they'd never existed. Those faces had never left him. They slipped into his dreams, waking him in the middle of the night. He feared them, the helplessness, the guilt of being forced to look away. And now, this scene: one boy pushed outside the church gate, silent and enduring, dragged that same fear straight back to the surface. Ethan drew a deep breath, his chest aching with it. If he turned away this time, Noah would become just another of those faceless children, another cut in a memory that would never heal. The boy's shadow on the concrete was a warning, a clear sign: either stop now, or carry one more wound you'll never erase. He lowered his cane, pressing its tip hard into the wet pavement. The hollow crack it made was like the end of hesitation. His eyes fixed on Noah, not sliding off, not searching for escape. What he saw wasn't just a boy left out in the cold. It was himself, years ago, unnoticed, unasked about, left behind. Ethan lifted his foot. The short distance between them no longer felt the same. He knew he had no right to turn away now. The old fear was still there, but something else had pushed into its place, a quiet resolve. That boy, that shadow, had become the anchor pulling him back into the present. And by stopping here, Ethan had finally chosen the road he'd been avoiding all these years. Ethan walked slowly toward the gate. His cane tapped against the bricks, each sound steady, like it was keeping time with the pounding in his chest. He didn't look for words, and he didn't think the silence needed breaking. When he got close, he lowered himself onto the cold stone step, putting his eyes level with the boy's. From his coat pocket, he pulled out a bottle of cold water, beads of condensation running down the plastic. He set it on the ground, right in front of the boy's dusty shoes. No explanation, no gesture to push it closer. Just a quiet offering that said, "I'm here. If you want it, it's yours. If not, it'll stay right there, waiting." Noah glanced at it. For a moment his eyes lit up, then dropped back to the toy car in his hand. His fingers trembled, caught between caution and need. After a long pause, his hand slipped down the iron bar and touched the bottle. The plastic rattled softly as he turned it in his grip, but he didn't open it. He just held on, tight, as if it wasn't water at all but proof that someone had noticed him. Ethan didn't interfere. He watched every move, patient. He understood that kind of caution, he'd lived it. Out there in the war, a hand reaching out could just as easily be a trap. You learn to doubt, to trust only what you could hold, not promises in the air. Now Noah clutched the water bottle the way Ethan once clung to his wooden cross, the one thing that tied him to the world. The cold wind slipped through the courtyard, stirring the dry leaves into a soft, rustling rhythm. Ethan leaned his cane against his knee, hands loose, eyes lowered. He had no need to press. Sometimes presence carried more weight than 100 words. Noah crouched down, knees drawn to his chest, still gripping the bottle. His messy hair fell across his forehead, but Ethan caught the faint red at the corners of his eyes. The mark of feelings held back too long. The boy didn't cry, but the silence he kept filled the space heavier than any sob could. A sparrow shot out of the tree above, wings flapping hard, making Noah startle and tighten his grip. Ethan was pulled back to his own past, remembering the times he sat just like this, waiting for someone to set something down in front of him. Not food, not medicine, just a sign he hadn't been forgotten. He gave a slight nod, as if to say the boy didn't need to do anything more. The bottle was in Noah's hand. That was enough. On that late autumn morning, on the cold stone step, two shadows, one large, one small, stretched out side by side. Not a word was spoken, but in the silence, the first thread of connection had begun. Ethan leaned on his cane and slowly pushed himself upright. He thought it was time to turn away, to leave the water bottle behind like a quiet period in the last light of autumn morning. But just as he turned, a tiny sound came from behind him, thin as smoke, fragile enough he thought the wind might blow it away. "You can't come in, because you're not really theirs." Ethan froze. The words bounced off the tile, slid across the empty courtyard, and landed straight in his chest. A brief moment, but it opened a whole chasm inside him where memories of being rejected sat like a scar that would never fully heal. He turned slowly, not meeting the boy's eyes at first, letting his gaze linger on the fragile shadow cast on the damp cement. Noah was still there, head bowed, the water bottle clutched in his small hands. That whisper had shrunk him somehow, made him smaller, more fragile in front of those tall iron bars. A gust of wind carried the smell of wet earth and incense from the church. Ethan's nose burned. That one sentence, just a sentence, was like a mirror, reflecting him directly. Years ago, lying in a field hospital, he had whispered to himself the same thing, that he no longer belonged to anyone. Friends had drifted away, comrades dwindled, and eventually all that remained was the sense of being set apart from everything he once held close. His hands tightened around the cane, knuckles white, veins standing out. He drew a deep breath, listening to his own slow, heavy heartbeat. No guns, no bombs, but that whisper made him feel suffocated more than any day in the war. It reminded him of his deepest fear, that a person exists only by someone else's permission, and when that permission is withdrawn, you disappear. Noah didn't look up again. He just rolled a small plastic toy back and forth with his fingertips, letting it move a short way before stopping. The gesture was small, persistent, like the rhythm of a child keeping himself from fading away. Ethan watched, feeling the pain in every tiny motion. Just as he had once turned over a wooden cross in his hands to remind himself he was still alive. He stepped forward, not through the gate, just closer. No words of comfort, no promises. Because Ethan knew that sometimes, just being there, not turning away, was the greatest answer to pain. From inside the church, the organ played slow, clear notes. In the empty courtyard, though, all that lingered was Noah's voice, cutting deep and echoing long. Ethan stood there, letting his heart empty, quietly realizing, there are moments when we can't choose where we belong. But we can choose not to leave anyone standing outside the door. The afternoon waned, pale sunlight slipping through the bare branches of late autumn, casting a thin, cold shadow across the churchyard. Ethan walked the familiar path, his wooden cane tapping softly on the damp bricks, each echo stirring memories of quiet footsteps long gone. No one passed by, no ringing bells, just the sound of wind and dry leaves whirling in the air. As he neared the church steps, his eyes fell on a small figure that made his chest tighten. Noah, crouched on the stone landing, head bowed, hair falling across his forehead, the thin sweater barely holding back the chill. His hands gripped a chipped plastic toy, as if trying to cling to a world that existed only in his imagination. He was asleep, breathing evenly, but his small frame shivered with the wind, like a leaf untethered, drifting. Ethan stayed back, careful not to startle him. Just a few steps separated them, yet it felt like an abyss. He remembered himself, wandering the corridors of a field hospital in afternoons like this, smelling antiseptic, hearing the quiet pain of comrades, the silent cries no one noticed. He understood this child's utter loneliness, the same kind he had carried, buried deep, long after the war ended. The wind picked up, sending dry leaves spinning around Noah like a solitary vortex no one could touch. Ethan drew a slow breath, hand steadying himself on the cane. He said nothing, touched nothing, just stood and watched. The silence stretched, heavy, yet respectful. He knew a child who had learned not to trust anyone would need time, and that any forced gesture would be meaningless. The empty wooden benches in the churchyard caught the afternoon light, worn surfaces etched with lines of memory and passing time. Ethan felt himself blend into the scene, a quiet part of the boy's small world. He reached into his coat and pulled out the wooden cross, holding it in his hands without knowing exactly what to do next, yet the stiffness in his chest eased a little. This was not rescue through words or deeds, it was presence, proof that the boy wasn't completely abandoned. A cold gust brushed his face, and Noah blinked awake. Ethan took a slow step forward, then paused, keeping the space just enough to avoid startling him. He placed the water bottle beside the boy, as he had that morning, but this time closer, an unspoken gesture of warmth. The chipped plastic toy seemed to matter a little more now, no longer alone in the spinning leaves. The afternoon softened, wind sighing over the church roof, leaves falling lightly on the stone steps. Ethan sat on a nearby step, looking at Noah without words. This moment, silent, chilly, and full of imagery, was the first time he felt a fragile, real connection between a returning soldier and a child learning to trust the world again. In that quiet space, Ethan felt his own loneliness no longer absolute. It was shared, in part, with the small boy, and in return, the boy's presence reminded him that strength wasn't only in walking through battlefields, it was in staying when everything around you was empty. The chill of the afternoon wind still clung to the damp stone steps of the churchyard, swirling fallen yellow leaves in lazy circles through the air. Ethan watched Noah quietly, taking in the small body trembling with each breath, like he might dissolve into the emptiness around him. He drew in a deep breath, hand resting on the cane, feeling its weight and with it, a quiet resolve. This was the moment not to walk away. Without a word, Ethan slowly peeled off his worn army jacket, the thick fabric faded brown-gray, smelling faintly of sweat in the damp cold of frontline days. He spread it over the stone step below, carefully making a makeshift place for the boy to lean on. The lingering warmth from his body seeped into the fabric, a small shield against the sharp autumn air. Noah didn't open his eyes, but the trembling of his body slowed a little when the cloth touched his back. Ethan sat down beside him, keeping just enough distance so the boy wouldn't feel pressured, yet close enough that when Noah opened his eyes, he'd see him. The moment passed like silent water, with no words needed, only presence. He laid his rough, calloused hand, shaped by years on battlefields, gently on Noah's tangled hair. His fingers trembled slightly, not from the cold, but from the sudden swell of feelings long buried. Noah blinked slowly awake, and the afternoon light caught in his clear eyes, fragile with fear. He blinked a few times, looked at Ethan, and stammered out a single word, delicate and taut like a stretched string, "Dad." The whisper, short as it was, collapsed every distance between them. Ethan didn't answer. He didn't need to. What he wanted to give the boy couldn't be put into words. He simply kept his hand on Noah's head, warmth radiating through the jacket, a quiet reminder, here, someone hadn't turned away, someone was staying. The climax wasn't in shouting or speech, it came from silence, from full acceptance, from simply being there. The wind blew past, but the old jacket held a private space between them and the churchyard. Dry leaves fell, brushing against the fabric with soft, delicate sounds, leaving the precious silence intact. Ethan let Noah lean against him, the boy's small shoulder pressed to his chest, feeling the rhythm of his heartbeat steadying. No pushing, no explanations, just presence, and an old jacket serving as a bridge between loneliness and trust. The moment stretched, untouched by the rush of time. Ethan realized strength didn't come only from battles fought, but from the courage to be present, to hold someone in their loneliest moment. Finally, Noah leaned fully into him, eyes half closed, breathing slowly, as if he had found a safe harbor, a fragile, real peace. Ethan sat there, among the falling leaves and the cold autumn air, feeling a spark of resilience ignite within him. Not every battle is fought on a battlefield. Some start simply by standing still, by not turning away, by offering shelter to a trembling child in a world that feels too big. And now, that old jacket, worn and frayed, had become a witness to that resolve, silent, but weighted with meaning. The pale yellow glow of the streetlights painted faint patches of light on the leaf-strewn road. The autumn wind stirred the trees, rustling the branches like a soft, silent rhythm. Ethan walked slowly, hand still holding tight to Noah's small one. The warmth from that grip felt like an anchor, holding him steady against the shadows that lingered in his own mind. The boy's little shoes shuffled over the damp earth, a soft clatter with every step, each one a fragile bridge between the haunted past of war and the present that was slowly learning to heal. Ethan looked down at his own hands, rough, veined, hardened by years of carrying weight in battle, and compared them to Noah's soft, trembling ones. The contrast made him realize that, no matter how many fights he'd survived, true strength didn't always come from holding a rifle or giving orders in a foxhole. It began with showing up, with being present, and with accepting that someone, the small child, could lean on him without fear of being abandoned. Silence passed between them, no words, no sound except the crunch of dry leaves underfoot. Ethan noticed the small things. The light from the lamp catching Noah's tangled hair, the way the boy curled close to him, shoulders shaking but hands staying put. These details stirred old memories, the long afternoons at makeshift camps, comrades sitting beside him in quiet, soft sobs, the earthy smell still lingering on their clothes. That silence now wasn't loneliness, it was a bridge. Ethan took deliberate, measured steps, unhurried, knowing each step carried its own rhythm of healing. The dry leaves breaking underfoot mirrored the fragments of memory he had long tried to push away, fragments he had wanted to forget. But with Noah beside him, eyes looking up without demand, simply accepting presence, Ethan understood that the greatest strength was walking someone through those cracks, not running away, not turning aside. The road home stretched out like a thread through the darkness, tree shadows casting pale streaks of light across it. Ethan felt each gust of wind brush his face, reminders of time passing, of chances missed, of people he hadn't managed to save. But now, with Noah following behind, little shoes pattering softly, he felt something shift. A quiet resilience was rising inside him, subtle but strong, urging him to keep moving, even as each step carried the weight of memory. At the end of the street, the old wooden house appeared, its roof tiles weathered by time. Warm light spilled from the window, a small island of comfort in the cold autumn night. Ethan opened the door, still holding Noah's hand. Each movement, every small step the boy took, felt like rearranging the broken pieces in Ethan's own heart. No words were needed. They walked in silence, and the empty chair in the corner took on meaning as a small hand rested beside him, as if part of the old, painful memories were beginning to heal, breath by breath, heartbeat by heartbeat, inside that worn house. The moments stretched on in quiet. Ethan knew that the journey home wasn't just toward the wooden house, it was a journey toward resilience, toward the return of trust, a place where the cracks in the soul could slowly mend, one step at a time. Ethan stood still on the porch, Noah's small hand still warm against his arm. Inside the house, the yellow light from the windows filtered through thin curtains, casting a soft glow across the cold autumn night. The empty chair at the dining table, one he had always glanced at in silence each evening, suddenly seemed to carry a different meaning. It was no longer a symbol of loneliness. It was waiting, holding space for a new presence, a chance for connection. Ethan took a deep breath, smelling the old wood, the faint smoke lingering from the fireplace, and the damp earth from the fallen leaves outside. Everything was worn, familiar, like an old heartbeat awakened after years of stillness. In that gentle light, Ethan watched Noah huddle close. The fear in the boy's eyes hadn't vanished completely, but curiosity was slowly breaking through. Noah looked up at the empty chair, tiny hands pressing against Ethan's chest as if seeking reassurance. Ethan didn't say a word. He just gave a slight nod, a silent message that here, in this space, he was safe. The quiet stretched on long enough for memories to wash over him, distant battles, comrades left behind on far-off fields, lonely nights in cold tents. The fear he had carried for so long began to recede, replaced by something new, resilience. Not the kind that comes from fighting an enemy, but the kind that comes from showing up, standing there, and facing loneliness and pain head-on. Ethan stepped up onto the porch, still holding Noah's hand. His eyes swept over the familiar details, the old wooden table, the neatly set dishes, just like every evening, but now, there was a difference. An empty space, ready to be filled. He let out a quiet sigh, realizing that the simple things he once thought impossible, a warm dinner, the shuffle of a child's footsteps on the wooden floor, had become possible, fragile as they were. The wind stirred around the porch, sending dry leaves skittering across the old concrete, revealing small cracks he had walked past countless autumn afternoons. The silence no longer frightened him. Instead, it taught him a lesson about strength. Sometimes, just stepping forward, just standing there, is enough to open a door to light. He felt his heartbeat slow, settling into the rhythm of the boy beside him. Ethan looked down at Noah, catching the reflection of the warm yellow light from inside on the boy's face. The glow brushed against his own features, and a faint smile flickered across his lips, not big, not loud, but enough to push back the darkness that had lingered in his heart for years. In that moment, he understood that his presence, his patience, and the courage to face loneliness were gifts he could offer Noah. He whispered, more to himself than anyone else, "Is staying enough?" There was no answer but the golden light spilling onto the porch. And yet Ethan realized that sometimes, simply daring to stay, simply daring to walk through the shadows of the past, is enough to begin the work of healing. Noah edged closer, holding onto his hand, and for the first time, Ethan felt that the empty chair at the dining table could indeed be filled with genuine presence, with steady courage, with warmth spreading step by step across the porch, across the floor, across a heart long scarred. That moment, quiet, yet brimming with hope, connected past and present, loneliness and warmth, fear and the growing strength stirring in Ethan's chest. The yellow light spilled across the porch, casting a glow on the chair that had once been empty but was now finally filled. Ethan stood there, holding Noah's small hand, feeling the steady rhythm of his breathing, the quiet trust in the boy. The silence around them seemed to wrap them up, soothing old wounds and reminding him that coming home isn't just about a place. It's about being present, giving love, and being loved in return.